The spring of 1536 brought an uneasy tension to the English court. Just a few years earlier, Anne Boleyn had stood at the center of power, admired and feared as the woman who had captured the heart of King Henry VIII. Their controversial marriage had transformed England, breaking ties with Rome and changing the course of history. Yet beneath the glittering surface of royal life, danger was gathering around her. Anne could feel the shift in the king's attitude. Henry no longer looked at her with the devotion that had once driven him to defy an entire church. The laughter and affection they had shared seemed to have vanished, replaced by coldness and distance. Courtiers who once eagerly sought her favor now whispered behind closed doors. Every smile felt forced, every conversation carried hidden meaning, and every glance seemed filled with judgment. The greatest disappointment for Henry was Anne's failure to provide a surviving male heir. Their daughter Elizabeth was healthy and intelligent, but the king desperately wanted a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. After suffering miscarriages and stillbirths, Anne found herself blamed for circumstances beyond her control. At the same time, another woman was quietly gaining the king's attention, Jane Seymour. Her gentle manner and obedient reputation stood in sharp contrast to Anne's outspoken personality. Powerful enemies at court saw an opportunity. Men who had long resented Anne's influence began working against her. Rumors spread rapidly through the palace corridors, growing darker with each telling. What started as gossip soon evolved into dangerous accusations capable of destroying even a queen. Anne tried to maintain her composure, but she understood how quickly fortunes could change in Henry's England. She had witnessed others fall from favor before. Now, for the first time, she feared that she might be next. Unaware of how close disaster truly was, Anne continued her daily duties while the trap around her slowly tightened, bringing her ever closer to a fate she could scarcely imagine. On May 2, 1536, Anne Boleyn's world collapsed with stunning speed. She was suddenly arrested and informed that she would be taken to the Tower of London. As her barge moved along the River Thames, she looked toward the ancient fortress that loomed ahead. The journey carried a cruel irony. Years earlier, she had traveled the same route in celebration before her coronation as queen. Then crowds had cheered her arrival. Now silence and suspicion surrounded her. When Anne entered the tower, she struggled to comprehend what was happening. She repeatedly asked those around her why she had been imprisoned. The accusations against her were almost impossible to believe. She had been charged with adultery, treason, and even incest, crimes that carried the ultimate punishment. The shock left her emotionally exhausted. Confined within her chambers, Anne found herself under constant observation. Every conversation was heard, and every action was noted. The attendants assigned to care for her were also expected to report her words to officials. Privacy no longer existed. The queen who had once commanded a royal court was now a prisoner whose every movement was monitored. Witnesses described her emotional state as deeply unsettled. At times she laughed unexpectedly, almost as if the absurdity of the situation overwhelmed her. Moments later, she would break into tears, fearing for her future and the future of her young daughter Elizabeth. She prayed often, searching for comfort in faith while trying to understand who had turned against her. News from outside only increased her anxiety. Several men connected to her had also been arrested. One by one, they were questioned and accused of sharing improper relationships with the queen. Anne insisted on her innocence and expressed disbelief that such allegations could be taken seriously. The uncertainty became its own form of punishment. She did not know what evidence existed, who had testified against her, or whether she would ever leave the tower alive. Each passing day deepened the feeling that powerful forces were moving beyond her control, and that the life she had built was slipping away forever. On May 15, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led from her confinement to face trial before a panel of England's most powerful nobles. The proceedings took place in a grand hall within the Tower of London, but there was little sense of justice in the air. Many observers believed that the outcome had been decided long before Anne entered the room. Still, she stood before her judges determined to defend herself. The charges were devastating. Prosecutors accused her of committing adultery with several men, including courtiers who had once served in her household. Even more shocking was the allegation that she had engaged in an incestuous relationship with her own brother, George Boleyn. These accusations were not merely scandals. They were acts of treason because they supposedly threatened the legitimacy of the royal bloodline. As the evidence was presented, Anne listened carefully. Some accusations appeared questionable, involving dates and locations that did not seem to match known events. Nevertheless, the atmosphere in the courtroom made it clear that logic and facts might not be enough to save her. Powerful political interests were at work, and Anne found herself standing alone against them. Despite the overwhelming pressure, she showed remarkable courage. Witnesses later described her as intelligent, composed, and eloquent. She firmly denied every accusation and challenged the claims made against her. Her responses revealed the sharp mind that had once captivated King Henry VIII and helped her rise to the throne. Yet the odds were impossible to overcome. The king's favor had vanished, and many influential figures wanted Anne removed from power. To them, her downfall would clear the way for a new queen and a new beginning for the king. After hours of proceedings, the verdict was delivered. Anne Boleyn was found guilty of treason. The sentence was death. The words echoed through the hall, bringing a final end to any hope of acquittal. Though the judgment condemned her life, Anne maintained her dignity. She neither collapsed nor begged for mercy. Instead, she accepted the decision with a calmness that astonished many who witnessed the tragic moment. After the trial, Anne Boleyn was escorted back to her chambers in the Tower of London. The verdict had stripped away any remaining hope. She now knew that her life would soon come to an end. Yet the days that followed became a remarkable display of resilience in the face of overwhelming despair. At first, the reality of her situation was difficult to bear. Every morning she awoke knowing that death awaited her, but she did not know exactly when it would come. The uncertainty was agonizing. One day she was told to prepare for execution, only for it to be delayed. The postponement offered no comfort. Instead, it forced her to endure additional hours and days of fear, wondering when the final summons would arrive. Anne increasingly turned to her faith for strength. She spent long periods in prayer and spoke with clergy who visited her. These conversations offered a measure of peace as she prepared herself spiritually for what lay ahead. Though frightened, she sought to meet her fate with dignity rather than bitterness. Those attending her during these final days noticed surprising changes in her behavior. At times, she appeared deeply saddened, reflecting on the dramatic rise and fall of her life. At other moments, she displayed unexpected composure and even flashes of humor. Some attendants later recalled her making light-hearted remarks, perhaps as a way of easing the unbearable tension. Her ability to remain calm under such circumstances left a lasting impression on those around her. Meanwhile, beyond the tower walls, life at court continued. Reports circulated that King Henry VIII was already focused on the future. Jane Seymour's position seemed increasingly secure, and preparations for a new chapter in the king's life appeared to be moving forward. For Anne, this knowledge must have been deeply painful. The man who had once pursued her for years now seemed eager to erase her from his life. Despite everything, Anne refused to let despair define her final days. She carefully prepared for her last public appearance, determined to preserve her honor. Though her crown, power, and freedom had been taken away, she remained resolved to face the end as a queen. The morning of May 19, 1536, arrived with a chilling sense of finality. Before dawn, Anne Boleyn was awakened in her chambers within the Tower of London and informed that the time had come. After weeks of uncertainty, fear, and waiting, the moment she had dreaded was finally before her. Yet those who saw her that morning were struck by her remarkable composure. Anne carefully dressed for the occasion, choosing clothing that reflected both dignity and simplicity. She wanted to meet her fate with grace, knowing that many eyes would be watching her final moments. Accompanied by attendants and guards, she walked toward the scaffold that had been erected inside the tower grounds. The short journey felt like the closing chapter of a life that had once seemed destined for greatness. A crowd had gathered to witness the execution. Some came out of curiosity, others out of sympathy, and many simply because they knew they were watching a moment that would become part of England's history. As Anne stepped onto the scaffold, she showed no visible signs of panic. Although fear must have weighed heavily on her heart, she maintained a calm and controlled appearance. Before the sentence was carried out, Anne addressed those assembled. Her speech was brief and carefully chosen. She did not accuse her enemies or condemn the king. Instead, she acknowledged Henry VIII's authority and asked those present to pray for her soul. Historians have long debated her motives, but in that moment, she presented herself with dignity and restraint. After speaking, Anne knelt and entered into prayer. Unlike most executions in England, a skilled swordsman from France had been brought specifically for the task. The sword was considered quicker and more precise than the traditional axe. As Anne waited, she placed her trust in God and prepared herself for the final moment. The crowd fell silent. The woman who had risen from noblewoman to queen, who had changed the course of English history, faced death with extraordinary courage. In her final seconds, Anne Boleyn displayed a calmness and strength that would be remembered long after the scaffold had been taken down. With a single swift strike of the sword, Anne Boleyn's life came to an end on May 19, 1536. The execution lasted only seconds, but the impact of her death would echo through history for centuries. The woman who had once stood beside King Henry VIII as Queen of England was gone, leaving behind a legacy far greater than anyone present could have imagined. In the immediate aftermath, Anne's body was placed in a simple wooden chest and buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London. There was no grand royal funeral, no magnificent monument, and no public mourning organized by the Crown. It was a quiet and humble ending for a woman who had once been one of the most powerful figures in Europe. For a time, it seemed as though Anne's enemies had achieved their goal. Henry VIII quickly married Jane Seymour, and the royal court moved forward as if Anne's reign had never existed. Yet history refused to forget her. Questions about the charges brought against her began to emerge almost immediately. As generations passed, historians carefully examined the evidence and discovered numerous inconsistencies in the accusations. Many came to believe that Anne had been the victim of political ambition, court intrigue, and the king's desire for a new marriage. Perhaps the most extraordinary part of Anne's legacy was her daughter. Elizabeth I declared illegitimate after Anne's execution. Elizabeth seemed unlikely ever to inherit the throne, yet fate had other plans. She eventually became one of England's greatest monarchs, ruling during a period remembered as a golden age of exploration, culture, and national strength. Today, Anne Boleyn remains one of history's most fascinating and debated figures. Some remember her as a reformer, others as a tragic victim, and still others as a woman caught in the ruthless politics of the Tudor court. What continues to captivate people is not only the dramatic manner of her death, but also the courage she displayed in her final days. Stripped of her power, freedom, and future, Anne faced an unimaginable fate with dignity. Nearly 5 centuries later, her story still inspires curiosity, sympathy, and admiration, ensuring that her name will never be forgotten.